The United States has produced some incredibly talented hockey players over the years. However, the game has changed multiple times and in multiple different ways. American skaters are reinventing what it means to be a professional hockey player. In the 1980s and 90s, the makeup of a U.S. hockey player in the NHL was much different from the players today. Thanks to new and improved processes, the way that these athletes practice all make the players of today generally more technically skilled than the players from yesteryear. Advancements in our world's technology have transformed the way all athletes train. Improved treatment of athletes' bodies in general has revolutionized the sport, and it's about time that we break it all down. It's time to reveal the biggest differences between NHL players then and now. When looking for the most significant changes, we must first ask ourselves, what rules have changed in the NHL over this time frame? The most obvious change in the NHL is that fighting has been drastically reduced due to a handful of new rules being put in place prior to the 2005 to 2006 season. These rules were basically a response to the ridiculous brawl between the Philadelphia Flyers and Ottawa Senators on March 5th of 2004. The first 58 minutes of the game were fairly clean, with both teams wanting to win. But in the last 2 minutes of the game, when the game seemed somewhat out of reach, it turned into pure bedlam. Two longtime enforcers took center stage late in the third period, with Donald Brashear and Rob Ray engaging in a bloody battle. In all, 419 penalty minutes were called between the two teams, a league record that still holds true today. That incident prompted the NHL to put new rules in effect. First one being any player that instigates a fight within less than 5 minutes into a game would be automatically suspended for one game, and their coach would be fined $10,000, even adding in a possibility of doubling suspension and fines if said player does it again. And to be completely honest, it was a long overdue rule. Even though some fans do enjoy the fighting, it's not conducive to a family-friendly atmosphere at the arena or anyone's safety. Helmets were also a main focal point as players' safety became paramount. Referees are assessing minor penalties to any player that removes his helmet before a fight. Another new rule states that players must immediately leave the ice surface if their helmet comes off. Furthermore, refs were asked to hand out penalties to any player who removes another player's helmet. A huge emphasis has been put on protecting the head and neck areas of the players. American players are understanding the severity and implications of it all, and it reflects in their style of play. Youth programs around the country are seeing shiftier skaters with fancy stick work, not necessarily as much grit and edge as players in the 80s or 90s. Prior to the 2007 to 2008 season, a rule was added on interference penalties, where offending parties would be assessed a major penalty and a game misconduct if the interference led to an injured player. All of these rule changes over time have led to a change in the philosophy for American hockey players all around the country. Most of them grew up watching the old school style but have figured out a better way, or at least have better rules to protect them. Another important aspect that changed the game is the review system. This allows the league to hold players accountable for their actions much more than ever before. When you compare this to the decades before, you see drastic changes in style of play. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, American hockey players had a rough style of play. Players like Jeremy Roenick and Chris Chelios played the game entirely differently than more recent stars like Patrick Kane or even Auston Matthews. Considering helmets weren't even mandated until 1980, when every new player entering the league had to wear a helmet, it's no shock that games were chippier. The demographics were completely different back then as well. In 1980, over 80% of all NHL players were Canadian. Only about 11% of the league population were Americans and roughly 3% were Swedish, with a few other countries sprinkled in. In today's NHL, the Canadian population has shrunken down to about 40%, and Americans have seen a huge spike in numbers, making up nearly 30% of the NHL now. Many other countries have made significant strides to increase their participation percentage in the league, but the United States has no doubt made the biggest leap. In the US, we are seeing more players emerge from every state all over the country. it's not just the northern states anymore. Although the North is clearly better suited for icy conditions due to the colder climates, the demographics are now evening out. In 1990, there wasn't a single hockey player in the league that was born and raised in Florida. In our most recent season, we had 11 different players that called Florida home. The same can be said for many other states across the country as the game increases in popularity. So why are Americans slowly starting to get an even representation in the NHL? Some would argue that players are tailoring their game more to the NHL's style than guys did back in the 80s and 90s. Back then, almost every American player had a physical side to their game. Cheap shots, dirty play, and of course fighting were rampant around the league. Most of the players had a mean side, but the game simply isn't like that anymore. Sure, fighting is still allowed for good reason, but with newfound intelligence on injuries, especially head and brain injuries, coupled with a new review system, players are much more aware of the way they should treat their mind and body. If you can avoid collisions, it's simply better for your health. Players are also held more accountable than ever before. Before, players could get away with some pretty nasty and cheap shots that injured somebody. But today, the cameras capture everything and from multiple angles. Nothing is missed. The result for American hockey players has been a quicker, faster product. Players are more talented with stick and puck than with their fist and physical toughness. The physical stature is still there in some sense if push comes to shove, but the physical intimidation part isn't really relevant anymore. Instead of trying to intimidate and beat up the opposition, front offices are finding players with the quickness to go around a defender or with smooth hands to deke a defender right out of their own skates. The days of tough-nosed enforcers sitting on the bench waiting for his moment to crush a skull are basically all but gone. After the 2004-05 lockout, many rules were put in place to speed up the pace of the game. The NHL wanted more offense. Goalies were no longer allowed to play the pucks in the corners. Teams stopped using a checking fourth line and started using a fourth line that could actually generate some offense. The NHL narrowed the neutral zone and created more room in the offensive zones. All of these changes married together to create a need for more offensive-minded players everywhere throughout the league. Thankfully, America and many other regions are listening and moving in that direction with their youth sports programs. So let's go ahead and compare two of the greatest players from these two generations. Both were first overall draft picks in their respective draft, and both are totally sensational players. Mike Modano, drafted first overall in 1988, played in 1,499 career games. He almost scored a point per game with 561 goals and 813 assists for a career of 1,374 points. Where his game differs is he had a substantial amount of penalty minutes with over 900 minutes spent in the box. Patrick Kane was a more recent first-round pick, and he also had a magnificent career. He's played in over 1,200 games and averages a point per game. The major difference between these two players is that Patrick Kane has basically half of the penalty minutes that Modano did. It falls in line with how the game was played in the 80s and 90s. There was a lot more hooking, holding, and interference plays all the time. Players were more inclined to play with physicality and power than just with finesse and speed. The same exact trend can be seen for many former USA players as well. Look at Jeremy Roenick, drafted in the late 80s. The guy could put the biscuit in the basket with over 500 goals, but he also had a mean side which showed with his almost 1,500 penalty minutes. We don't see Auston Matthews piling up penalties like Roenick did. Americans like Kevin Stevens, Bill Guerin, and Keith Tkachuk lived in the penalty box on some nights. It was just a totally different mindset overall. So what do you think was the biggest difference between players then and now? The physicality is certainly different, as we discussed. The speed and the tempo of the game is also different, and the mental awareness is certainly heightened on all ends, from the players to the coaches themselves. Most of these changes have made the game safer for players and even more entertaining for kids and fans across the nation, especially when it comes to drawing new fans into the sport. If you like this video, please do yourself and us a favor and hit the like button. Subscribe to this cool hockey channel if you haven't already, and I'd like to thank you for checking out this video. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.